So have you ever really stopped to think about how something like raw power, just taking stuff by force, somehow gets turned into something we all agree to call law? How does a system that starts with a sword convince us to just willingly obey? That's the huge question we're going to dig into.
Let's just start with this idea, because it really sets the stage. It's suggesting that the systems we live in are basically wearing a disguise, a costume, to hide where they really came from. It's a pretty critical way to look at things, and it frames everything we're about to talk about.
Okay, so what is this legitimacy? Well, the key thing to get is that it has nothing to do with what's technically legal. I mean, plenty of awful things have been legal throughout history. No, legitimacy is different. As the sociologist Max Weber pointed out, for power to actually last, it needs people to believe in it. It's like this strange moral alchemy that convinces us that a system or a ruler has the right to be in charge. It's all about moral authority, not just what's written down in a law book. And here it is. This is the core argument we're exploring. The idea is that if you trace back any piece of property, any law, any constitution far enough, you're not going to find some nice, clean origin story. What you'll find is an act of force, an act of taking something from someone else. So, this brings us to this massive shift in history. As empires got bigger and bigger, trying to rule everyone with just a sword, well, it just wasn't efficient. You needed something smarter, something more subtle. And this was the first great trick: figuring out how to turn the weapons of violence into the paperwork of bureaucracy. Just look at how the language completely changes to hide what's really going on. What used to be called conquest now gets this nice, gentle name, settlement. What was obviously theft gets laundered into a legal title. Tribute, that was taken by force, becomes a tax that you owe the state. The action is basically the same, but the new words, they create this whole illusion of being civilized, of having consent. I love this line because it just nails it. This wasn't just a change in strategy, it was a psychological operation. The whole point was to make everyone forget the original violence, to make the new power structure feel totally normal, like it was always meant to be this way. Okay, so how do you actually build an illusion that big and make it stick? Well, you need institutions. You need these massive, powerful structures whose entire job is to create and reinforce that story of legitimacy. Let's take a look at how they work. The argument boils down to these three huge pillars. First, you've got law, which created a set of procedures that made being controlled feel orderly. Then you've got religion, which came along and gave a divine reason for why some people are on top and others are on the bottom. And finally, economics, which built a system where taking part in your own exploitation somehow feels like a free choice.
And you can see how each one does its job. The law turns obedience into a ritual. Religion says the whole hierarchy is part of a divine plan. And the economy? It uses things like voluntary contracts to make an unfair deal look like a perfectly reasonable agreement.
This all leads to a really powerful way of thinking about it. Power isn't just a bunch of buildings and rules. It's a performance. It's a giant, well-staged play with costumes, scripts, and rituals, all of it designed to make the audience, us, believe the story and obey the actors on stage.
And think about it. You see this stuff everywhere. Judges wearing special robes, politicians speaking in those deep, serious voices, saluting flags, swearing oaths on holy books. It's all theater. They're props and stage directions meant to create this feeling of awe and authority, to make us forget we're just looking at regular people playing their parts. Which, of course, leads to the most important question of all. If this whole thing is a performance, then who wrote the script? Who decided what the plot was going to be, and who got the best parts?
And here's the brutally simple answer. The rules aren't just out there waiting to be discovered like laws of physics. Nope, they are written. And guess who writes them? The people who are already winning the game. According to this analysis, that's not a flaw in the system. That is the system.
This chart just lays it out perfectly. If you're wealthy, you get to define what property is. If you're the state, you get to define what a crime is, and it usually involves protecting that property. And if you're the elite, you get to define what order looks like, while everyone else, well, we're just supposed to follow along.
This quote just captures the whole irony perfectly, doesn't it? A law that looks totally equal on paper can actually be designed to maintain a deeply unequal society. It's such a brilliant way of exposing how fake the whole fairness thing can be.
All right, so now we get to the final and maybe the most brilliant part of the whole trick. How does this system of external rules and performances get inside our own heads? How does it become the way we just naturally see the world? Because we are.
We inherit this whole setup and we're told it's just common sense. We're tied to laws we never agreed to and debts we didn't create. We are literally born into a game that's already started, with rules already set, and then we're told that playing by those rules is what it means to be free.
And this lie is kept alive through this constant, humming background noise of reinforcement. History books tell the winner's side of the story. Schools just happen to skip over the uncomfortable parts about power and class. Questioning the system is discouraged, and all those national rituals, the pledges, the holidays, they just repeat the official story over and over until it feels like the only truth there is.
But what happens when the show starts to fall apart? What happens when the audience in the theater stops believing the actors on stage? This is where things get really interesting. See, modern power is clever. It rarely uses a sword anymore. It wears a velvet glove over its iron fist. A landlord doesn't need to threaten you. He just needs an eviction notice. A boss doesn't need chains. He just needs you to be dependent on a wage. The coercion is baked right into the system, so it feels less like force and more like just the way things are.
So you really have these two key moments. There's the spellbinding moment, that's when violence puts on a smile and calls itself law. But then there's the spell-breaking moment. That's when the illusion of legitimacy fails and the raw force that was hiding underneath all along comes roaring back out as riot police, foreclosure notices, and prison sentences. The lie is confessed.
And that's when it all starts to come apart. When the story everyone is told just doesn't match up with their everyday lives anymore. When the system promises fairness, but all people see is a rigged game, the cracks in the whole facade really start to show. And that, right there, is the whole point. This illusion, this performance of power, it works incredibly well. But it only works as long as we don't see it for what it is. The simple act of calling it out, of naming the trick, is the very first step toward breaking its spell.
So, I'll just leave you with this question to think about. Once you see the stagecraft, once you understand the mechanics working behind the curtain of law and order, can you ever really look at it the same way again? Once you see how the trick is done, does the magic just disappear?